I think that we'll just try to dive right in here. Thank you everyone for coming. This is our Canola and Coffee speaker series, and today we're talking about Clubroot. Hoping to have sort of a Q&A. That's the goal here, so that if for those of you that have questions, you can get them answered, and we can move forward on managing this disease on farms in Ontario. There's still a lot of sort of information that people need to hear about this disease and kind of focus on in terms of having success going forward. So, today's speakers are Dr. Ruth McDonald. She's a pathologist at the University of Guelph. She works with a number of different crops and horticulture crops, and has access to the Bradford Research Station, which may not be its official name, used to be called the Muck Station, which has Clubroot on site. So that's a sort of convenient in terms of research. So thank you, Mary Ruth, for being here. We also have Keith Gabert. He's an agronomist in Alberta with the Canola Council of Canada. So he has lots of experience with this disease, and has been in Temiskaming district with me on a visit at least one time. So that's great for a bit of context. We have Will Runnalls, who many of you probably know. He's the Ontario Canola Growers Association chair and a producer in Temiskaming district. And Will and myself, Meghan Moran, are going to grill these experts with questions. And so we want to hear your questions as well. So you can enter in the chat function. You can type in questions at any time. You can also, at the bottom of your screen, there's a was it reactions, Christine? Reactions button. And if you want to raise your hand, and so that if you want to speak up and use your microphone to ask us a question verbally, you're welcome to do that. So use the reactions to raise your hand, and we'll call on you. I have Christine O'Reilly, our forage and grazing specialist, here to kind of help with the Zoom stuff. So we'll keep going here we'll start with a presentation, relatively short, from myself, Mary Ruth, and Keith, and then dive into some questions. And we are recording this, if I didn't already say that. All right, so little bit of history in Ontario. The first time Clubroot symptoms were found on canola and recorded was in 2016. So an agronomist and a crop scout in Nipissing district had plants that were sort of wilting and stunted, and they couldn't, thought they had crossed all their T's and dotted their I's, and couldn't identify what was going on there until they pulled up some plants, and this is a photo that was taken. And so that's quite a few years ago now, about 8 years. And so we know that the disease has spread from there. And I believe there was yield loss in that field. So we went ahead and started soil sampling in 2016 and 17 in quite a wide range of areas in Ontario to see where Clubroot might turn up in those first couple of years of finding the disease. So the blue dots on this map are where we took a soil sample and did not find Clubroot. And then the yellow squares are where we found it in a soil sample. The red squares are where we found plants with symptoms. So the samples were taken in the 2016, 2017. I added a few more dots to the map up to 2020, but this is out of date, right? We knew that Clubroot was already had a bit of a foothold, and so we didn't really continue mapping it. This is, was already widespread at that time, and you can almost guarantee that it's more widespread now. And so just a few pictures. This was in 2017. I was surprised to see this in Temiskaming, clubs just jumping right out of the ground. It was just in a corner of a field, so no yield loss there. But the grower didn't know it was there at the time, and you can guarantee that it has, spread since then. And I don't think that a lot of steps were taken to kind of manage it at that time. Here's another example of a field where the grower didn't know they had Clubroot, didn't see any symptoms, and just an example of, what can happen. This is Keith's arm, so proof that Keith was in Temiskaming. We pulled up some plants when we were looking at Swede midge damage and found a few little clubs, but the plants look healthy otherwise. So this is kind of how it gets a foothold and spreads. So if you want a soil sample tested, yes, no, is there Clubroot in that soil? I can do that for you, so contact me. If you want to get in touch with Mary Ruth McDonald because you have Clubroot and you want her to look at those clubs, which we'll talk about soon, what she can do with that. So it's sometimes difficult to navigate the University of Guelph websites and get a hold of Mary Ruth. You could contact me as well. So I am going to turn it over to Mary Ruth to talk a bit about the Clubroot life cycle. Thank you, Mary Ruth.
Right, thanks, Megan, and happy to be here talking about Clubroot. As Megan mentioned, we do have clubroot that occurs naturally at our research station, so that has helped our research. And I got involved with a group in Western Canada because I'd been doing a little bit of work on clubroot on vegetable crops before it became a problem out west. But the center bar in this slide is the soil, and at the top you'll see the resting spores. This is the persistent part of the pathogen. So the organism that causes clubroot, it's not a fungus, it's not a bacteria. It's actually more closely related to the organism that causes malaria than it is to a fungus. So that doesn't matter for a lot of things, but it can help to explain why it's so difficult to control. So those resting spores persist in the soil for a long time. When you plant a susceptible crop or even some other crops, those spores germinate and they produce a zoospore that can actually swim through the soil moisture. And those zoospores are attracted to root hairs. They infect a root hair on the plant, and then they multiply in the root hair. So you get 20 or 30 more zoospores. Those are released back into the soil. So we're back into the blue bar. And then those swim back to the root, infect the main root, and start to multiply. And that's what causes the clubbing on the root, which does all the damage because it disrupts the whole root system. The plant can't get water and nutrients. So it multiplies a lot. You can get billions of those tiny resting spores in the root. The root starts to rot, as you can see on the far side, and then that returns them back to the soil. And one important point, this organism needs a living plant to reproduce. So those spores persist in the soil for a long time, but they're not increasing in the soil. They have to have that living plant to produce more clubroot. Next slide, please, Megan. So I mentioned I've worked on clubroot on vegetable crops. It's been known on vegetable crops since about the 1920s in Canada. And for probably the last 40 or 50 years, the recommendation for vegetable growers has been to increase the soil pH up to 7.2 or higher. And we've done a little bit of work to look at this on canola as well. So that's a sort of a simple recommendation. It's not always quite that simple. Next slide, please. So this is a controlled environment study where the plants and soil had the optimum amount of water. And we looked at the effect of temperature as well as pH, you can see along the bottom there, on how much clubroot will develop on canola. So the two bottom lines, the gray and the yellow, that's what happens when the temperature's low at 10 or even 15 Celsius. With lots of the organism and pH from 6 up to 8, we don't see very much clubroot at all. You might see one of those small clubs on the plants. But as soon as the temperature is up to 20, which is that orange line in the middle, we get over 60% clubroot. And then as you see, the pH increases, we're down to below 20%. But the important part, or maybe the most important, the blue line at the top is 25 Celsius. We get 100% clubroot severity at a pH of 6, and it gradually decreases, But even at 7.5, we're still over 60%. And most importantly, even at a pH of 8, we still have 40% clubroot because the temperature and the pH, or temperature, pH, and soil moisture are all perfect for the development of the disease. So if you had a field with pH 8 and you didn't have that section where the pH was 6, you wouldn't see that dramatic drop from 100 down to 40. It would still look like there's quite a bit of clubroot in the field, and you might wonder if adjusting the pH was really having much of an effect. Next slide, Megan. But we do see these dramatic differences in our trial. So at the front, that's where we didn't apply any lime, the pH was 6.3. And where we did apply lime at the background, you can see those plants look a lot healthier. They're blooming. The plants at the front, I doubt if there'd be any yield from those at all. Next slide. We were asking the question whether it's pH or calcium, because normally growers are applying lime to raise the pH, which puts a lot of calcium into the soil. So the past couple of years, we've done this trial where we had gypsum to add calcium, but not change the pH, potassium bicarbonate, so it increases the pH, but there's no extra calcium. The standard, of course, is lime, increases pH and calcium. And then we looked at another product that's just become available in the last few years, wollastonite, which provides some lime to increase the pH. And I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But next slide, please. So this is the clubroot after 7 or 8 weeks in the ground. The numbers at the bottom of each of those bars is the pH. So our check was already relatively high at 7. Adding the gypsum didn't increase the pH. And we did see as the pH went up, the amount of clubroot went down. And the most important part was that the bicarbonate that increased pH without adding calcium definitely decreased clubroot. So it is the pH that's important, not so much whether you're adding lime or anything else that adds calcium. Next slide. As the Canola Council has talked about for a long time, it's all about the numbers of the resting spores that are in the soil. And where we have 1,000 or less per gram of soil, we normally don't see clubroot, although this is just an example. If everything comes together, we can still get quite a bit of clubroot at low numbers. When we've got 1,000, we're starting to see tiny little clubs, but you have to look pretty closely, thanks, to find those. And then as the numbers increase, we see a lot more clubbing. And at 1 million resting spores per gram, which sounds like a lot, that's when we get that really severe disease that probably means little or no yield. But these do vary with soil conditions. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and Keith is going to talk about things that can be done to keep the numbers low. These are real numbers from a grower's field in Saskatchewan, where we did have a trial to look at rotation crops and other things that could be done to potentially lower the number of resting spores. So on the side, those numbers are in millions, from 1 million up to 128. And as we just saw, 1 million resting spores is enough to cause 100% disease. So this field had impressively high numbers of resting spores. But this pattern is something that we see often. We have similar results from Quebec, from an Ag Canada research station in Normanton, and many other sites in Western Canada. although it's not always as specific as we see here. The black line with the red dots is fallow, so there was no crop. And then we had wheat, cover crop, and also looked at trying to solarize the soil, so put plastic down to heat it up. But the important point, if we're looking at the bottom, in the first year from 2019 to 2020, we see a pretty good drop in the number of resting spores. So with a black dot, 128 down to maybe 2024. So that's a considerable drop, still more than enough to cause 100% disease. In the second year, we see another drop, not quite as dramatic, but the important point is that after the second year, we often see the number of resting spores staying the same or almost the same for 3 years, up to 6 years when people have actually looked at that. And then the sad situation in this field is that even with that dramatic drop, there's still more than enough resting spores to cause high levels of disease if those weather conditions are right. If it's very dry, you get very little clubroot develop. Next slide, Megan. And so we were looking at some different crops like wheat, ryegrass. We also wondered about cover crops that people might grow. Vegetable growers use oilseed radish, some of the daikon radishes like tillage radish to improve soil structure as a winter cover crop. And then there are a lot of other brassicas that are either grown for forage or for cover crops. So when we looked at 12 or 14 of these, they sorted themselves out into that group that's highly susceptible. So if there's clubroot in that field, there's going to be lots of clubroot on those cover crops. And fortunately, under the mostly resistant, a lot of the daikon radish and the tillage radish are really very resistant to clubroot. And then the occasional variety of turnip or forage is quite resistant as well. And I think that's pretty close to my last slide. Oh, sorry, yes. Pathotypes. We have been doing some sampling and we've received samples from Northern Ontario. To the right, that's just to show that the pathotype on vegetables has remained the same and consistent for as long as anyone's been looking at it. There aren't any or very few resistant vegetable crops are grown. So we had samples from 2023, and we found a number of different pathotypes, 2, 3, and 8. But the important point was that they could all overcome first-generation resistance in canola. I think Keith is going to talk about first and second-generation resistance a bit more. And then the next slide, Megan. And so we did some sampling in 2024 as well. We've only assessed the first 3 of those. 2 of them could overcome first-generation resistance. That was pathotype 8. And we actually found 1 sample that didn't overcome first-generation resistance. But if you don't know the pathotype in your field, it's a safe bet that it will be able to overcome first-generation resistance. And I think that's my last slide. Thanks. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can answer questions about Wolstenite if anybody's interested.
Yeah, I thought we might save that kind of for the management end of the conversation. Keith, do you want to jump in now?
Yeah, I think I've got my audio turned on and everything
Yep.
should work. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Keith Gabert. I'm the Canola Council agronomist for Central Alberta. So been chasing clubroot or looking after clubroot for a number of years. I've been with the council about 10 years. So I'm in unfortunately, that map would indicate that I cover the hotspot or the center of clubroot in that Edmonton, St. Albert area in Alberta. So We've had Clubroot in the area from on canola that we're aware of from 2003 on, and our primary tool in managing that disease, or our best tool, has been genetic resistance. But this slide is just up here to show you that there's 9 Canola Council agronomists that if you did have a canola question, you can feel free to reach out and ask, and our specialties are listed under our names there on the site. Lots of great information on the canola website, the Canola Encyclopedia. But might as well look at the next slide for the reason that we're here is canola that's infected with clubroot tends to really get growers' attention. And it's still at the point in my local area and in that Edmonton area where often it's still patches that tend to focus on the moist areas of the field or the low areas of the field. It really depends on the year. We see that this disease travels with soil, and that's been that's the standard story from the beginning of time. I don't know if that's a safe bet to say, but even the Romans described clubroot fairly well. So this isn't a new disease. The Europeans were relatively excited when we did get it in our canola crop, because at 10 or 20 million acres of a broadacre crop, they were excited that we were going to do some work. But this particular disease tends to travel with equipment. It doesn't matter if it's the local electrical company or your cultivator. It tends to be distributed on things that move dirt. The next slide will show you that the current and Alberta is not clubroot is not an Alberta disease, but boy, it sure feels like it when you're talking to growers in Western Canada, because we've had a really hot spot around the city of Edmonton for a number of years, and as we've looked for clubroot, we've historically found more and more fields. So our current situation is that we've identified another 300 fields in 2024. About half of those were not documented as having clubroot in the past. And because we've looked at clubroot for more than 10 years, a number of the fields that we're looking at are back into canola, maybe for the second or the third time since we found galls in that field. But the colored counties here are counties that have at least one case of clubroot. The situation across the prairies, if we go to the next slide, is a little bit different as we look. You're looking at more than 5,000 fields where it's documented in Alberta. That number drops to 82 as soon as we cross the Saskatchewan border, and 35 in Manitoba. So in terms of spread, this disease has probably been a little aggressive than we predicted in 2005 or 2003, but it's still managing to move. And while it's not necessarily documented in every case, this tends to be moving with some sort of equipment purchase, or if farmers, at least in Western Canada, farmers tend to farm a relatively wide distance apart. So we'll see growers in the Calgary region that farm in the Peace, or we'll see growers in the Edmonton area that also have a farm in Saskatchewan, and we suspect that tends to be where a lot of this material moves. So really an Alberta-centered disease. The nice thing about, nice or bad, depending on how you want to think about it, is when we first diagnosed clubroot, we indicated that there was genetic resistance to this disease, but it would be years, 5 to 10 years, probably before we managed to deploy genetic resistance. And we had one of the breeding companies come up with a clubroot resistant product. I think it was in 3 or 4 years. By 2009, we had varieties on the market, and in very short order, it was really difficult to tell if there was any extra upcharge. Like the clubroot resistance is now a given. It's not an additional thing that you have to look at, and it's becoming difficult. Shouldn't use that word, but it's rare to have a variety that doesn't have some sort of clubroot resistance on the market in Western Canada now, because growers that feel that they're really free of clubroot in their neighborhood are few and far between. I'm going to move to the next slide, a slightly different representation. This map is a year or so older than the information on the last slide. But sorry, back up to the map if you could. The the map that shows here is actually not necessarily the same. In Alberta, it's confirmed fields with disease on the roots. And in Clubroot in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they do have some of those fields that are colored in, if you really read the fine print, where clubroot's been detected in the soil sample, but not necessarily as visible symptoms. So not nearly the issue yet, and we would like to keep it that way, that it is in Alberta. Our messaging on Clubroot is relatively straightforward. The next slide will say that we'd like you to keep your spore loads low and local. So I don't think I'll read, well, actually, I probably should read the headers at the very least, but keeping spore loads low would include crop rotation. And you saw on Mary Ruth's side that there's a really steep curve coming down over years on the number of viable spores in that sample. The scary part on her slide is that it went from 128 million down to 1, and 1 million is still, in my mind, way too many spores. But that 2-year crop rotation or 2-year break, so canola 1 in 3, was a really important thing for us to tell Western Canadian growers, because when we first started to talk about Clubroot, we talked about spores living 15 to 20 years, and a grower would just throw up their hands in frustration and say, okay, then crop rotation isn't something that I'm even going to consider. But with at least a 2-year break, you get 90% of the spores that are in those patches or in that field dying and disappearing and not being an issue. So if you can keep your spore load low, so if you're starting at 1 million and 90% of them die, now we're in a range where we can have a significant impact on our ability to reduce infection. I like to tell growers that even if they've deployed resistance, regardless of what cultivar they're growing, that they should be scouting those fields. Just treat it like they don't have resistance, so that they're really well aware of if they have clubroot and if it's coming back. We've, for years, as soon as it was available, indicated that we should grow clubroot-resistant cultivars, control brassica weeds in the crop. There's a number of weeds that are related to canola, so that's important. The local part of that message is really so that you don't inherit somebody else's problems or somebody else's. I'd hate to call it a clubroot breeding program, but in Alberta, we know that there's fields where different pathotypes are being selected, and if they are a particularly successful or virulent pathotype, that's not something that you'd want to encourage the spread of. So if you can keep the spores that are causing clubroot in your area local and not spread around, that would really assist in managing the issue. And reducing tillage. So one of the things that we recommended at the front that was probably a mistake was some really significant sanitation on equipment. And while that is really great advice, if you've ever tried to really clean an air seeder, it takes more than a day's time to get all the dirt off and to get as your pressure washer in the machine, to not have mud still running out of some of the channel iron. Like it's hours that you're spending. So while that sanitation message is important, particularly for a new piece of equipment or a new to you piece of equipment, simply knocking off visible dirt and making sure you're not moving dirt lumps the size of your head between fields or to fields, from fields where you're sort of suspicious you have clubroot to fields where you think you're relatively clean. That's really important. And the less of that sort of tillage or soil movement that you do, the better. Probably won't focus too much on patch management. It is a viable control measure for clubroot, but it's particularly successful if you find clubroot while it's defined patches in your field. And one of the things that we've begun to recommend to growers is that you treat it like one of the noxious weeds if you find it early enough, and actually dig some of those galls out, bag them, and remove them. If you can put lime on, Mary Ruth indicated that's a really successful technique. And when we're in the greenhouse, when we're in small pots, in a beer cup, lime is really effective. We can cure clubroot in a beer cup, but the amount of mixing and incorporation that you get when you're in a small pot is not nearly the same as you would when you're in a field. So we don't see those kind of results when we're doing some patch management. But if we can keep growers out of that patch for at least an extra canola cycle, if they're going to seed it down to grass, that would really help us out in terms of if we're on a 1 in 3 rotation and now we've grassed that patch the first time we find it, it'll be at least 6 years before we're back to canola in those patches. But in saying that, there's not a lot of growers that are managing clubroot with patch management or grass patches. It is a successful option, but it's something that's seen as one more step. And when growers find a patch in their canola and they really get excited about it, and they have someone like myself come out and take a look at it. If they haven't done anything with it by the next spring, they're obviously likely just going to be driving through it when they have wheat or barley or peas or something else in the air seeder. So if we could, I've said this before to growers, if you could, go find a big rock and dump it in that spot, or a pile of posts or something from the yard and put it there just to discourage traffic. Just staying out of that area would be relatively important, because in fields where we see pretty significant patches, if clubroot resistance is going to fail, it's typically those patches where it comes back again. I'm going to leave it there, Megan. I know I have a few more slides, but it's probably more appropriate if people have questions or want to ask something specific there.
Yeah, we can definitely pull up some of those slides as we go. So I'm just gonna check the chat, but we're gonna start just start some questions on some of those basics in the life cycle, and then soil management and soil movement. So Mary Ruth, you said it's not a fungus, it's not a virus, so it's something totally different. I think that's important for everyone to kind of realize. But so how long do resting spores remain in the soil?
Yeah, there's that small portion that survives after the first 2 years that seems to remain, 6, 10 years, maybe longer. As you can imagine, it's really hard to uh, do that research. And there's always the question, in real life in a field, if we're finding clubroot 10 years after the last canola crop, were there brassica weeds? Was there, volunteer canola? Was there something else that was helping to maintain it? But it seems like that 10% that survives the first 2 years survives almost forever,
Great.
or practically forever from our point of view.
Awesome.
Okay. I have a more general question too. So I take it clubroot has existed. Does it exist in nature? Like, is it natural to Canada and it's just the introduction of brassicas that we see the problem? Or would it have been imported from Europe, or it's just something that exists throughout the world?
Oh, really good question. And it was imported from Europe. They figure, forage turnips that were brought on ships to feed the cows that were on the ships probably brought it to North America. So it's right. It's not something that just always existed here. It was introduced.
Awesome. Okay, we're just gonna keep grilling you like one after the other. So you had this slide with the different crops that you tried growing on that on I know that was not just the one field in Saskatchewan, there's other research, but so is there something that we can grow that like triggers spores to germinate so that it drives down spore counts? Do we know enough about that? Like what our rotations should look like?
So we have done some of that work. Some of the ryegrasses will also trigger germination, which is to me is so weird, but we've got lots of results. My group, others that have done that. We looked at spring wheat, not winter wheat, and spring wheat does have some effect. Again, as Keith says, when you do all this in a beer cup, we can see those differences. Unfortunately, they're not huge differences. So, in our controlled trials, we can see maybe a 20% drop, and we can quantify that. In a field situation, it's a lot harder. And we are still doing some of those trials. We're looking at ryegrass and we're looking at daikon radish to see if that'll help bring the numbers down. But one of the things that we find in all of our research in the field is that when we take a soil sample, it's dramatically different, even like a foot apart in a field or a meter apart in a field. So it's really hard, even in a small research plot, to get consistent samples to really get firm numbers on some of those things.
Right. And so before I turn it back to you, Will, there's a question that says, how do we know our numbers? That's why testing for spore load in the field is next to impossible, as it sounds like. But we can talk a little bit more about testing as we go, I think.
Yeah, it's more of a yes/no story when we test soil.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Very good.
can I jump in again with there's another related question in the chat because I know, Mary Ruth, you were testing a bunch of different crops to see if they are hosts. Would a crop like camelina be susceptible to clubroot?
Yes. Yeah, the scientific literature says that it is. We haven't tested it, but I saw that in the chat. I made a note to myself. It might be good to try a couple of different cultivars this year and just confirm that. But other people have found that it is susceptible.
Go ahead, Will.
So you touched on what plants were hosts, like cover crops. So that was good information. How important is it controlling volunteer canola? So once you have canola on your farm, you usually have it that comes out of the back of the combine. Can we get the cycle starting again in the fall when you have volunteer canola coming up behind your wheat or your barley crop? Can that whole cycle start again?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. That is a real problem, and we've seen that in some of our research sites in Alberta. We go back and there's volunteer canola, and you pull up the roots and there's clubs. But the brassica weeds are a problem too. So in the fall, it all depends on temperature. We've seen falls where even when we're trying to do our trials, say a late seeding of winter canola, or if we're trying to do another trial, if it's a warm fall, we get lots of clubroot. If it's cold and the soil temperatures drop to 10 degrees Celsius or below, then we don't get any clubroot.
So what's the time frame? How many weeks? I guess it can
Yeah.
infect pretty early, right? Like
it can. When the weather conditions are ideal, even 4 weeks, you've got enough clubroot in the roots that you'll have some resting spores form, and they'll go back to the soil and just add to all those other resting spores that were there.
If we do a burn down and destroy the canola after, let's say, winter wheat or oats in the 2-week period, is that enough to shut it down? Like, it needs that 4 weeks before the spores can be re-released?
Right. So 2 weeks is good. But there again, so much depends on the temperature, but within 3 or 4 weeks, you're starting to get a risk.
So we've got a couple of questions in the chat, kind of building on this. You've touched on the brassicas, but also kind of branching out into non-brassica crops and how that relates to clubroot. So the first one is that you mentioned ryegrass. So that's Lolium perenne and Lolium annual ryegrass. I can't remember the Latin. But he's asking, would cereal rye have a similar effect? So
right.
They're not the same thing. They're not the same thing is my point. So ryegrass and cereal rye.
Yeah. In general, it seems like all of the cereals have some effect, but when we've looked at different varieties of perennial ryegrass, some are, again, in an experimental situation, some are a bit better than others. but it's very difficult to do that research. So it looks like all cereals will have a small beneficial
Right.
effect, but we haven't looked at them all.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank
And
you.
moving in that direction, so cereals have a slight benefit effect. Ryegrass is not a cereal. But then I
Oh,
guess there's also some
grasses,
evidence. Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, they're all grasses. Um, I guess there's some evidence that orchard grass and red clover are weak clubroot hosts. This is coming from the government of Alberta. Um, how much research, or is there any research that's currently being done on some of these other non-brassica hosts or potential hosts?
Okay, so clover, I'm not aware of clover being a host of Clubroot. So, and Keith, do you have any
It's mentioned
information
in
on
one of
that
the
work?
it's mentioned in one of the Alberta government fact sheets from, I think it's 2004 or something. There's really not a lot of evidence that there's any gall formation or additional spore production there. This is, as far as we're aware, a strictly brassica disease. So it's not while it is mentioned, you are correct, it is mentioned as a weak clubroot host. I'm not aware that there's been any new work or any other work that causes us to be concerned there. It does seem that clubroot isn't really that fussy in those first couple years. Like it throws everything and the kitchen sink into producing more spores. But most of those spores need to find a home in the first 24 months or they die. So unfortunately, there is that really long tail of surviving spores. And unfortunately, Ruth said basically forever. But in terms of a farming crop rotation, 15 or 20 years, it's essentially forever. So it doesn't matter. But the idea is if we can not let it get away on us, hopefully we're in a manageable zone there after year 3. So yes, while orchard grass and red clover are mentioned, it's not considered a risk or in my mind there I don't even consider them hosts.
Yeah, that's important because we do use clover a fair bit here. One more question about volunteers. Do if we're growing a resistant variety and then that resistant variety volunteers, like it is a hybrid crop, do those volunteers carry resistance?
Really depends
Yes.
on if the parents have clubroot resistance on both sides.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
So we've got a male and a female making that hybrid. And when we first had clubroot resistance available, some of the volunteers, an identified percentage of the fields would be clubroot of the volunteers, sorry, would be clubroot susceptible.
Hmm.
So that is sort of a standard statement that we're not sure what the volunteers will have for genetics in them, and you're not really sure if your volunteers are all coming from the last canola crop you grew. So
Sure. Yeah.
it's really hard to know what's in those volunteers, but in in the recent hybrids, I would say that clubber resistance genetics is likely on both sides, and that's a less of a concern, but there's really no way to know.
Right. Very good. All right. Maybe we'll talk about some soil movement questions, Will.
Yeah, so that would be one of the biggest ones here is because we're in a high precipitation area, still a lot of tillage. So can we get clubroot moving in soil-borne soil particles, especially like we have high organic matter soils that blow in a warm spring? Like, is that all it takes is dust blowing in the air from one field to the other? And yeah, like even you look farther, can soil movement be moved on geese, migratory birds, sandhill cranes moving from field to field, especially if there's tillage done?
Mary Ruth is smiling, so I should probably leave the answer for her. We have some really good evidence and some great research work back in the mid 2000s showing that yes, dust samples will have clubroot. I've heard researchers comment along the lines of there's probably a very very thin layer of clubroot across Western Canada based on the amount of wind movement that we see. We typically don't see that as a significant introduction of clubroot, or we don't see that as a significant threat because it seems that clubroot follows either equipment or water runs. There's usually a pretty direct physical link when you start to track clubroot. It'll follow a water run through 6 or 7 sections of land, and a grower that has clubroot along that water run, if he's a frequent canola grower, suddenly he has really significant clubroot, and if he's a really infrequent canola grower, maybe we can't find galls in that field when he's growing canola. So it's a matter of supplying the conditions, unfortunately moving the dirt in some way. So migratory geese could do it, but you'd have to have enough soil there and then provide the host frequently enough to have it get away on you under conditions of moisture. So our worst case scenario here for seeing clubroot is to have a really moist spring, warm, moist spring, get the disease up and running, get big galls forming on the canola. And one of the things that we've probably done wrong with clubroot is we keep showing these pictures of really, really ugly galls that are easy to see in the picture. But if you look at the picture, there's still a nice green stem that's half an inch large running out off to the top of the picture. And that canola looks reasonably healthy at 30 miles an hour or 55 miles an hour driving past your field. So you don't see, you assume that if it's got this bouquet of galls that it must look absolutely horrid from the road, but you don't see clubroot until you get some moisture stress or you start to see that crop wilt in midsummer August temperatures. And if you continue to have moisture stress, you get these brown patches scattered all through your field where the rest of your crop is green. So that's one of the things growers had for a number of years sort of assumed, well, if it's that bad in the picture, I have to be able to see it.
Right.
And you just have to pull plants, unfortunately, to scout for this disease. There's just no
Mhm.
substitution for that.
Hmm.
And I had
Got
one
off on
other,
a tangent, so I'm going to throw it back to you, Will.
and then I had one other comment about soil water movement. So the topography here, and we have to tile drain everything. And like you said, my water might flow across 6 other sections of land. And having so much moisture and water, could the clubroot spores travel out of the topsoil into our subsoil, into our tile drains, and then being released farther down? Or are they restricted to the topsoil, or they could probably move anywhere the water is moving?
I don't know, Mary Ruth, if I have a guess, but do you have an opinion on that one, Mary Ruth?
Yeah, we haven't really thought much about tall drains, but the resting spores can survive in water for a few weeks for sure. We don't know exactly how long. Um, when it moves down through the soil, um, you may not, you're still going to get resting spores stuck in the soil. They're not all going to move down and out the tile drain. Um, so there is a possibility, but water moving across the top of the field and moving that topsoil is far greater risk.
Um, does soil type play much of a role? Like we've got muck soils where Will farms, and then, some farms are more clay. Like does that is it only that moisture holding that is the real key piece there?
I would say yes. Sadly, muck soil is very conducive to clubroot, but uh, there's not that much muck in Alberta, and there's still lots and lots of clubroot. So, Keith?
Yeah, we have a lot of acid soil in my territory at least, and that link between low pH and clubroot has been around and known for years. But really, it just seems to be linked to moisture and frequency of canola being a much stronger driver than a soil pH or a soil type story. So if you've grown canola and haven't noticed that there's galls there, or it's let it get away on you, that seems to be the driver of the disease. It's not as well. Soil pH is mentioned often. It's just not as high it's more important to understand how often you've got canola in your rotation and than anything else on the list.
Right. Yeah, we should probably get down into some of those management questions, Will. One question from the chat is how have you found a way to effectively clean equipment? Like, a practical way to clean equipment, or is it, as you say, just knock off the bulk of the soil to reduce the risk?
Yeah, I don't think there's any updates on, how to, there's no magic way to clean equipment. But I think the uh the important difference in our story about equipment sanitation is when we ask growers to do the whole meal deal, knock off visible dirt, scratch off everything else, pressure wash the equipment, keep it damp with a 2% bleach solution. I think it was for 20 minutes, maybe it was half an hour. When you do that, you very quickly throw up your hands and say, I'm not doing this again. This isn't worth doing. It's not a good use of my time. I could have seeded another 40 acres in the time it took me to clean this. So dialing that back and saying knock off visible dirt, because if you understand that Mary Ruth's using numbers like millions of spores per gram of soil, it's really important not to have 5 lumps the size of a baseball fall off your plow or disc or cultivator or seeder as you move from field to field. And if 5 minutes removes that level of dirt, that first 5 or 10 minutes is probably doing 90% of the risk reduction. So really important to sort of focus on what we can do and continue to do in a consistent manner versus doing a fantastic job on clean equipment. Now, in saying that, I mentioned it earlier. I have had growers, buy equipment from the Edmonton area and take that 6 or 8 hours outside of that region, and I don't think there's no excuse for not doing the full meal deal on that piece of equipment. If you're bringing it from a known clubroot area, you really do want to do the knock visible dirt off, pressure wash, bleach story on all of those. But unfortunately, no magic on cleaning equipment that I'm aware of.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay. Okay. So if we move into management, just so there is
Yeah.
no chemical control for clubroot that exists. In theory, you can't fumigate, you can't spray anything. It's just too much, or actually there's
I'll,
nothing to control it.
I'll leave that for Mary Ruth. We continue to look. Calcium cyanamide, sort of a fertilizer slash fumigant in my mind, had shown some promise. But even I guess if the vegetable growers don't have a standard pattern on some really high value crops, unfortunately the answer would be no. But Mary Ruth is, I'm sure, got some comments there.
Yeah, so fumigation, we've done trials with chloropicrin and like Vapam, Med-M sodium. It definitely provides a dramatic drop in resting spores, but you still can't kill everything. In the UK, they have done a lot of work on the calcium cyanamide. We did some years ago on muck soil, and it also and actually they've looked at it in Alberta too. It'll drop the resting spores, and you get a big drop in clubroot, but it's not 100%. And those are, expensive interventions. There are a couple of fungicides registered, but in vegetable crops, the results are extremely variable. So there's very few vegetable growers that apply fungicides even. The idea would be for a cabbage or broccoli, you'd apply it when you transplant in the transplant water. Sometimes that reduces clubroot, but the results are so variable. There are very few growers that actually do that in practice. So the short answer is no.
Okay, here's the big question, I feel like. So we had growers that had devastating losses this season. Like I saw a field where there was more vacant patches of dead canola than there was canola. So what should we do with that field over the next few years? I guess there's two scenarios. One, that was a non-resistant variety, let's say. And then the second scenario, what if that was a resistant variety and you had a devastating loss? It's not an easy question to answer maybe, but I guess it's like over the next few years, what are these growers supposed to do?
Mary Ruth, you want to start or should I start?
You go ahead, Keith.
So the good news is that clubroot resistance really works well. So functioning clubroot resistance, something that's effective against the clubroot that's in your field, works really well. But the pressure that that field would be able to exert on the clubroot resistance is also really high. So if you've got that field and you're on a 1 in 3 rotation, you're starting to follow our advice, but at really high levels. So we're going to say 10 million, 20 million, 128 million spores. That 1 in 3 years with 90% of them die probably still means you're still at the 1 million or 10 million mark for spores. And the clubroot resistance will look really good, but you'll likely have some small galls or some galls present in that field. And the ability of clubroot to regenerate itself or produce seed and keep seed back in the ground is so high, even off of those small galls, that's likely why we see resistance breakdown. So where we have these patches in a field and you come back in with canola in 4 or 5 years, you usually don't see an issue the first time you have effective resistance in the field, but maybe even as soon as the second time you use that same resistance, you'll see those patches come back. So for someone that has had a wreck, I would probably suggest that they're looking at 2 cycles out of canola. That's not an official recommendation of any kind, but that's sort of how I would look at it. If you can get that, out to the 5 or the 6 year mark, I have been in fields in Western Canada where the only thing in the field and 30 acres or more of 160 acres field is dead canola 6 inches high with galls on it and a bunch of cleavers and other weeds keeping the field green. And at the 5 year mark, I could not find galls with functional resistance present. And I spent a half a day looking for clubroot galls. So we know it works, but the idea is to keep that tool working. And if you simply said, "Oh, I've had clubroot, and now I'm just going to go on a decent rotation of 1 in 3 and see if my clubroot resistance works," that's probably not the best recommendation on those fields because we'll see that clubroot resistance will break down. Now, we probably do have actually quite a few sources of resistance now if we look across the companies that are providing it. But I don't think any of them would want to see us, give it the acid test and start rotating through as many as we can. So time is your friend on if you had a clubroot wreck, time and figuring out a rotation of something else, putting it down to a forage for a few extra years. If you need alfalfa or there's alfalfa in your area, that would be probably your best bet just to get a few more years on that before you start to rely on clubroot resistance genetics. What did I miss, Mary Ruth?
No, I can't add anything to that, Keith, but do want to emphasize what Keith said, that there are fields in Alberta where they originally had major problems with clubroot, and same thing, I've been in a few of them, and now they're growing canola and you can't find any clubroot. So there is hope. Following the recommendations can work really well.
But again, I said it earlier, somebody somewhere is not following any of the recommendations and is breeding clubroot on your behalf. So make sure you don't inherit his soil.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm going to use that, Keith. I love that idea.
This is a question for Keith. Is there 3rd generation being close to release that you hear in the West?
So actually, there is no agreed upon nomenclature or naming system for the generation. So unfortunately, yes, there's 1st generation. We talked about 2nd generation. I've heard people talk about 3rd generation. One of the companies labels their material as CR, and they have a numbering system 1 through, I think it's about 9 now. But that numbering system doesn't help us that much because we don't know when you're looking at that number. And you can look at the description. Is it the 1st generation, which came from a variety called Mendel? So you might hear me mention that word. Is it Mendel resistance plus something new? Is it something completely different from your 1st gen? And there is an agreement that 1st gen is that Mendel resistance that we talked about. But the naming system is not agreed upon or consistent enough to even be useful. So it's once you've got past this 1st round of clubroot resistance that we've used now for 15 years, knowing if the next clubroot resistance that you deploy is going to work is almost impossible
Hmm.
unless you're one of the few canola growers that have had resistance breakdown. You've had galls removed from the field, taken to the U of A, and they've pathotyped them for you. And at that point, they tell you the predominant pathotype. And we know it's, I don't know if maybe cows is maybe not a good analogy, but it's a really mixed commercial herd probably in
Yeah.
your field. And so while you might have black white-faced cows, there's probably some Holstein genetics or some Simmental or something in that herd that you really don't see that are very likely still present in that population. So we always assume that there's enough variability in the clubroot pathotype that it will get around the resistance genetics that's there. But at least knowing that, the majority or the predominant pathotype is pretty useful. But even then, if you get this letter and number combination from our naming system for clubroot, that doesn't necessarily mean that the company you go to when you say, okay, here I have 9E in my field. That's how it's categorized in the Clubroot differential set or the Clubroot naming system. What do you have for me that will work? The seed companies probably haven't tested
Hmm.
on that particular strain, but it does help us start to narrow it down. And if we can pick a newer clubroot resistance genetics that should work, that's really the only tactic that we have.
Interesting. All right, we'll probably try to go like just 10 more minutes if we can, because there's still lots of questions. I'll get to Ben's the last question in the chat there in a second, but I guess, trying to ask you more clearly, Keith, like, do growers have the information they need to rotate resistant varieties like you would rotate herbicides, for example, to mix up those traits as a way of prolonging the usefulness of those varieties? Or do we not really, can a grower not really doesn't have the info to do that?
So I'm going to get Mary Ruth or maybe my coworkers Kendra or Jason that are on the call to, remember this answer and tell me if I really screwed up. But so at this point in time, I would say growers don't have the information that they need to effectively rotate clubroot resistant genetics. But in saying that, we've had remarkably few issues
Okay.
in deploying new resistance genetics. So when a grower that's had clubroot, and I've had this happen, selects another variety to deploy. And you have to remember we likely have fields in central Alberta that have had the same clubroot resistance 5 times or more used in that field. So they will figure out, and remember I said you're going to scout like you don't have working resistance. They will have had the opportunity to figure out if that resistance source is broken. And when they go to a new source of resistance, by and large, it's worked, and it's worked well for them. They don't see clubroot resistance there. When we get asked when do I rotate to a new source of resistance, the only answer I've heard that sounds reasonably good is, well, use that next source of resistance at least twice, or unless you see resistance breakdown, and then move on to something else. Because we're already at the point now where our new hybrids that are coming on the market, you're probably selecting for traits other than clubroot resistance as well. So you're looking for pod shatter, or you're looking for some higher yield, and it happens to come with a different source of clubroot resistance
Right.
genetics. So outside of that real hotspot where we're probably at the billions of spores per gram of soil, most growers have been really successful using existing varieties that are out on the market. And I've been brave enough to say that if you're not in an area that's had, devastating patches, you probably will never see clubroot impact your pocketbook,
Hmm.
because we've been very successful at keeping it low enough and at bay enough. But at the same time, if you do have a field that's had dead patches of canola, the pressure there is so strong on the number of spores per gram that you really have to keep an eye on that and extend your rotation and try to understand. Now, I've made it sound really optimistic. I'm not seeing issues. I'm driving around the countryside. I'm not seeing patches. That's all true. But there are a handful of growers in that North Edmonton area and by handful, it's probably, only two or three where literally have pots of dirt. I haven't seen it myself, but I've talked
Mm,
to retailers who do it, where they literally have pots of dirt with
taken from the field.
six seeds of canola in it
Yep.
because they're at a real loss. They've struggled with Clubroot since 2003. They're at a real loss on how do I know if this next variety is going to have galls or not. So we're going to get better. Our pathotyping is getting quicker and more defined. We hope to have at some point in the future a lab test that'll tell us those pathotypes. So we've made really big steps forward, but it's still in terms of having a management strategy and the ability to direct growers really effectively. No, I don't. We're not there yet.
Yeah, fair enough. So that was your answer, Ben. Use a variety that works at least twice, and then you can move on to something else potentially. Okay, well, we have
Mary Ruth, what did I miss?
No, that was great. The seed companies won't really tell us what genetics they're using. So it's not like a herbicide where you know the active
right,
ingredient.
right.
But there's lots and lots of work being done on better, more durable resistance. It's just takes time.
Yeah. All right, we've had a couple people drop out of the call because we're at the hour mark. Will, is there like a burning question you have left you want to
Is
ask?
is there any questions that we missed in the chat, or have we covered most
Um,
of them?
well, there was also a question like, is muck a bigger problem than a mineral soil, or what is the reason that aside from pH?
Probably the moisture holding
Okay, yeah,
capacity. So
right,
all the things we talked about, it's easier to get those ideal conditions in muck with low pH and high moisture. But that slide I showed with the two different pHs, that was muck soil.
right,
And so the pH, you can raise the pH and reduce clubroot on muck.
right.
And I guess one other comment we should make: winter canola carries no clubroot resistance, correct?
We have one registered variety named Mercedes, and it is not resistant to clubroot.
Yeah. So Mendel, that variety I mentioned before, was a winter canola variety where we
Mm,
sourced our resistance from. So yeah, it's not. It's simply a matter of what's available in the marketplace. So
yeah. In theory, they exist because other parts of the world are growing winter canola and have clubroot, but we don't have
Yeah.
any here. And
Mendel's highly susceptible. I was trying to do one of those temperature trials in the fall, and it just warm fall, it had 100% disease.
gotcha. Okay, Ben's looking for clarification, so I feel like we should elaborate. So there's no real risk to going to a new or second generation resistant variety, even in the absence of disease. Like it's not wasteful.
no, we've had that question in Western Canada for years. In fact, we got a lot of pushback from our European counterparts when we said we wanted people to use a clubroot resistant cultivar, but
Mm,
the real damage is if you get clubroot in your field and you get some of these patches and lots of galls produced and the spore load is high, um, then you have pressure on any other resistance that you use. So our approach in Western Canada has been to use clubroot resistant genetics. I don't think there's no real risk in going to a second gen now. The challenge is what will you have to go back to? So if you're growing a second gen now, which again, second gen just means something in addition to or different from Mendel, um, you simply just need to keep track of what you've used in that field in the past and scout to see if you have gulls coming in, because then you're going to have to look and see what's available. And you might be able to go back to first gen. It's just a matter of trying to figure out what's there and what's going to work for you in the future. So unfortunately, that naming system is just really not working for us. And it's only slightly better than the past, where we would say, well, whatever you do, and this applied to blackleg or clubroot, whatever you do, grow a different variety, because at least there's a chance it'll be something different than what you deployed in the past. So we are getting better, and we will get better, I think, quickly, but that's kind of vague when it comes to comes to planted $15 seed in a field and running that risk. So it will be nice if we can nail that down.
Awesome. Okay, Claire has a question in the chat, and I know Mary Ruth has worked with Claire in the past, so I'm actually going to back up Claire and ask a more basic question that I think is kind of important that we hit on before we end. So should producers pathotype the clubbed samples that they find in their field? And it's not an easy thing to do. It takes Mary Ruth is the only game in town and the only lab that will do that, and it takes many weeks to get those results. Should a grower do that? Send you samples?
So for production, no. Unless, I mean, there may be a question about whether the clubroot in their field can overcome first generation resistance, but they probably already know that based
Right.
on what they're growing.
Mhm.
So from a research point of view, we're still interested in that. And
Gotcha.
we're getting closer. We're trying to develop a quick method to do that plus minus for first generation resistance, yes or no.
Mhm.
But we're not there yet, which is why we want those clubs. But the only thing the grower needs to know is whether their clubroot overcomes first generation resistance. And like I said, they probably have a good idea on that just from what's happening in their field.
Okay, it's important. Thank you. But I think there's value in send me a soil sample and I can do that free test that takes some of the guesswork out. There are spores in that sample or there are not, right? There's value in it's a free test, so of course there's value in it.
But yeah, and as Keith said, that's just a yes or no.
Yeah,
And if the answer is no, it's still not a guarantee that there's no
good
clubroot
point.
in the
Good
field.
point.
And actually, that's
So
really important. It's just it should give you some confidence, but it's probably still there. Like if in Western Canada, at least in my area, we've often joked, if you haven't found clubroot in your field, you haven't looked hard enough. Um,
Yeah.
but maybe it's only one or two plants, and that'll never blow up and get away on you, perhaps. But we have to sort of assume it's there.
Yeah. All right. Well, I would say we have 2 minutes left. And Will and I were chatting on the phone yesterday and, looking across Ontario, and there are quite a few growers that farm sort of just north of London, Ontario, or in parts of southern Ontario and farm in the north. And that's important. Like the big losses we're seeing to clubroot are in Northern Ontario, but it still exists in the other counties as well. And there's equipment moving back and forth. And as you say, we've got tiles draining, into other people's fields and things like that. Like we all need to be on the lookout for this. So that's my PSA, I guess, mine and Will's.
and so my final request, one, I would like to get clubs. Two, we're looking for a field, a grower's field in southern Ontario where I can have a small patch to do some field trials.
Yep. Very good. I always ask every year as well. Oh, my screen keeps blacking out. Something weird going on. Okay, Will, any final thoughts, questions?
No, I think we covered it all.
Yeah.
Are you, Mary Ruth, you're looking for a field that isn't brassicas or just some land where you can plant brassicas?
Yeah, and some land where there's clubroot
And
and we can plant brassicas. And I mean, we're looking for, a tenth of an acre or even less, just, a small area, but, and we'll keep the weeds down. But um, all of our work, or almost all of it, is done on muck soil where we've got high levels of the clubroot organism. Be really nice to test some of this in mineral soil, which most of you are dealing with.
Awesome. Well, I guess I'll say thank you so much. This has been great, and I'm glad we had a pretty good turnout. Hopefully, we've created some awareness and some ideas to move forward with. And so, thank you, Mary Ruth. Thank you, Keith. As Keith mentioned, Mary Ruth has actually been a great available to talk. I appreciate that a lot, Mary Ruth. Keith also mentioned, if you have canola questions and the local specialist isn't giving you the answer you need, you can call Keith, right?
or any of my other coworkers.
Awesome. And thank you, Will, so much for joining and giving that boots on the ground experience. And that's it for today. So we'll post a recording of this meeting online for anyone that missed it. And wish you all a great day and best of luck managing Clubroot going forward. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you, Christine.